Hello, Herle Burlyites. In conventional times, we would simply, and sometimes irreverently, tell you how much we enjoy and appreciate having sponsors to this podcast. But quite obviously, these are not conventional times. And the work that TELUS, our presenting sponsor, is doing to help customers and communities right now is just so important. Whether it's providing frontline healthcare workers and vulnerable populations with supplies and technology that will help keep them safe, or supporting people who are isolated and at risk with virtual health care and mental wellness support, TELUS will do what's required to help Canadians during this health crisis. In addition to this, TELUS is waiving all home internet overage charges through the end of April for anyone who isn't already on an unlimited plan. They're waiving all easy roam travel passes and pay-per-use roaming charges for postpaid customers in all countries. They don't want anyone to worry about the cost of connecting with their loved ones if they're stuck and unable to safely return home to Canada. And because TELUS believes that no one should have to worry about not being able to pay their bill on time if they've been financially affected by COVID-19, they're supporting customers with financial challenges by providing flexible payment options. Finally, in response to the pandemic, the TELUS Friendly Future Foundation, has announced a $10 million commitment to help urgently support and enhance public healthcare capacity and community response across Canada. For the latest information about TELUS's support during the crisis, visit telus.com/COVID-19. Thank you, TELUS. We're back with the much-loved political panel. Up in the top left, in her resplendent Montreal Canadiens uniform, Jenni Byrne. And having missed the notice and wearing a blue corduroy shirt in the upper right-hand side is the great Scott Reid. We are not in the beautiful confines of the Orange Lounge today. We are doing this from our respective quarantine bunkers. And welcome to the COVIDeo episode of the Herle Burly. Go ahead, Scott. What do you got to say?
Well, the reason I wore the jersey today, sorry, Scott, the reason I wore the jersey is we were tweeting about the 1993 playoffs, which of course Toronto lost in the conference finals and Montreal ended up winning the Stanley Cup. Patrick Waugh won the Conn Smythe, being the player that has won 3 Conn Smythes, more than any other person. But who is the only player to win the Conn Smythe before they won the Calder?
Ken Dryden.
Exactly.
There you go. Only person ever to win the Conn Smythe before they won Rookie of the Year. It's maybe the most bizarre statistic in sports, really.
Yep.
Congratulations, Ken. Stat. If you're listening, you probably aren't. You what?
I love that stat because he was a champion before he was in the league, technically. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So what are we going to talk about today?
Literature?
Literature would be interesting. So listen, obviously everything has changed so much since we last talked. And I think maybe the last time we talked, we were talking as much about the collapse in the price of oil as a result of the Saudi initiative as we were about COVID-19. And that just tells you how much things have changed in the intervening 2 weeks. I guess there's a lot to unpack here, and we'll spend the whole episode talking about it. But let's start, I think, as we must, with how is Canada and how are Canada's governments handling this issue on behalf of Canadians? Jenni, do you want to start us off?
Well, I think that ultimately everyone's somewhat doing what everyone expects them to do. Although yesterday the Canadian government, Justin Trudeau, and the Canadian government basically announced draconian measures to bring in tax changes that have been not how people have governed themselves in 800 years. So they, of course, backed down on that after bringing it in. But I think that we're getting to the point where we're going to see what people's breaking point is. It's going to be the decision between health and the economy.
Yeah, it does seem like it's coming down to that, especially in the States where they're starting to put that equation explicitly on the table. Scott, you've generally been pretty complimentary of the government on this handling of this issue on the podcast. You have, however, on social media been very active in talking about the need for more aggressive financial support for the economy from the government.
Yeah, I feel really strongly about it. And I think there's an urgency to it. I think there's an urgency to it, not simply because we need to take action fast to help, but because options that are available now may no longer be available later. And that's my great concern, is that the longer that we wait, if we pursue a strictly incremental approach to financial support for businesses and for individuals, we may be forced to only provide mitigation measures as opposed to being more proactive. What I mean by that is this. And by the way, I agree with Jenni completely on the bill. It was bizarre. And I actually misread it. I feel a little embarrassed. I initially reacted on social media saying, oh, this is good because we need to be able to have flexibility and the ability to move fast, and then realize they're actually not even asking Parliament to authorize tax increases. And that, of course, has literally never been done in 600 years of Westminster model. So that's bad. And I'm glad they backed up on that. And I don't know, I can't understand how.
And an absurd length of time, an absurd period of time. Why would they propose to go without parliamentary scrutiny for 18 months?
I assume there was
18 months. It's insane.
Yeah. Doesn't make any sense. I don't know what they were thinking. And the danger is that there's still a lot of substantive, discussionable policy that needs to happen here. And I'm worried it's all going to get bogged down into a fight now about jurisdiction and process. And the government clearly overstepped, and the government's right to, the opposition is right to call them on it. But it also gives an excuse for politics to enter into this at a time when we still really need to get to some broader places. Because Jenni, I'm really with Scott. I think that we need to do something. Either we are going to abandon this shut down the economy strategy like Trump is hinting and let everybody out, or we need to financially support this economy. Just so we're clear,
right? Let grandma die, right? Okay, grandma, you're done, okay, so that we can go to the playground.
No, okay, but how much can the government afford to pay people to not work?
Quite a bit.
How can the UK afford an 80% wage subsidy? And all the Scandinavian countries are doing it again as well.
We'll see how long they can actually afford that.
Okay, let me dive in then. Here's my proposal, and I've been advocating this for over a week. I think you are facing a situation that is more dire than 2009. I think it's more dire than the Great Depression. And the reason I say that is that those were liquidity crises. Those were crises of confidence in the banking and financial system, where if the central banks and banking institutions and government put enough money into the system, people would eventually dig out. This is a situation where people must stay home. And my view is the government can either say, we acknowledge that there's going to be mass layoffs, like tens and tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people laid off. We acknowledge that governments are going to...
Close to 1 million people have applied for EI in Canada over the last week.
Right, so holy motherfuck, right? So
which is an indication of why the government's moving too slowly, because once people fall onto EI, they're already into a cycle.
And
of unemployment.
Sorry, dude.
No, it's right. And it's more difficult to put those businesses back together. It's more difficult to put those sectors back together. And the psychological impact on people is devastating of being unemployed. And lastly, you cannot live in Toronto on employment insurance. You can't pay the rent in Toronto on employment insurance.
So we've got a situation where we have to pick our impossible. So one impossible is that we let a bunch of people die. We actually don't even know how many that would be. Another impossible is we say governments are going to get in the business of paying business to not lay people off so that those people can stay home. And here's what I think we should do. I think governments in Canada, I think the federal government should be saying, we're going to use our fiscal capacity and we're going to coordinate with G20 partners so that we have comparable policies across major economies. And what we're going to do is pay businesses up to 75, 80% of that individual salary for the individual labor. And they stay home for 60 days, 90 days, pick your number. And then we reevaluate. Will it cost $10 tens of billions of dollars, maybe hundreds of billions? Yeah, it's going to. Is there an alternative? Well, the alternative is we drive millions of people onto EI. They end up with less pay. They actually hunker down. The economy literally grounds to a halt. Businesses close and go bankrupt. And we can't restart this thing when and if it happens. And by the way, that's all assuming that the government systems don't become so stressed that EI is broken and can't flow. So to me, we have to do that. And then we have to say, central banks, how do we print money? How do we avoid hyperinflation? How do we deal with credit swaps between debtor nations and indebted nations? How do we figure all that shit out? In the same way we had to invent new rules and new structures in 2009, we got to do it now. But right now, government needs to stop saying we're going to help you get through layoff and stop the layoff from happening in the first place. Because if we seize this goddamn engine of the economy up, we may not be able to restart it. I feel really strongly. I just can't understand why we haven't done this already. Like we don't do it today, we're going to end up trying to do it 3 weeks from now, and we'll do it a lot worse.
But I don't know how the government can afford this for this. How sustainable is this?
You have to throw your fucking.
Well, it's unsustainable for years, but we could afford $150 billion deficit this year.
Yeah,
if it was only this year.
And I think that's where we're at.
But how do we know that that's the case? We're talking like the decision in terms of like not sending athletes to the Olympics is 4 months down the road. We're talking months and months that we're like the economy is not sustainable to have everyone stay at home.
But the economy.
Well, this is why there's this new theory.
But this is the question. There have been 600 cases in Canada. 20 people have died. So I am not like I have been staying in my apartment. I have been staying in my apartment. I have asthma, which I developed later in life, and so like I have issues with my lungs. I'm staying inside. I am I am self-isolating. But at the end of the day, how can our economy sustain itself? Like China's already back. So Las Vegas, 10,000 people were laid off in the casino sector across Canada in the last week. Like 10,000 people. Macau just opened their casinos yesterday. China's back. They're like completely.
Maybe that's a great sign. Maybe that's a great sign. And it means if we shut this down and pay businesses to not lay people off, and they don't sever the relationship between employer and employee.
Okay, but the difference.
Wait, let me finish. Then they can resurrect the economy quickly in 90 days. Or maybe China's wrong, and there'll be a second wave of it, and they're going to have to shut things down all over again, and more people will die. And I'm like you. I had tuberculosis. I have lung disease. And so, my challenge is, I had a doctor flat out tell me, 1, you're more likely to get it. 2, if you get it, you're more likely to die. And so, I think we're going to see if it's doubling every 3 days, we can't just say, well, it's only 12 deaths or whatever many deaths it is in Canada. It's going to get fucking worse. We're going to start burying people, and not just old people. And by the way, old people also are nice.
I'm sorry about your 2 lung issues. I've been training for years as a smoker, so my lungs are ready for this challenge.
Exactly. Build up immunity.
Built up. Yeah, anything that doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That's what they say. What you people are talking about is why some people are saying we need a third approach, not the kind of ignore it and not the flatten the curve approach that Canada has been following and other countries have been following, but a period of time, because a lot of people, Jenny, are agreeing with you that the economy, this can't be sustained over any period of time. And so what they're talking about is a very draconian initial period of a 4 to 6 week complete lockdown where you shut the whole thing down. And then you open it up after that and you use very intrusive state monitoring messages to geo-target and isolate vulnerable populations and carriers of the disease and isolate those people out. I saw on Twitter a guy from Taiwan saying that his cell phone went dead, the battery went dead, and within 45 minutes the police were at his door looking for him. So the theory is real lockdown for 4 to 6 weeks and then normality unless you're a carrier. of the thing. But I don't know whether Canadians would accept those kinds of restrictive measures.
Yeah, but I don't.
So I think we're left with flatten the curve as best suits our culture.
But I actually don't see like any of the restricted services that we had. Like there is no reason why the wine rack and the LCBO need to stay open. They're not they are not a
crazy ideas today, man.
What?
You want the LCBO to shut?
But it is not
I'll like digging my own hole then. Fine.
But so I'm kind of like where David is at. I actually just don't think people are going to sustain this much longer. Like I think that like in another week or so, people are going to have been stuck in their homes. Like I don't think there has been, like we have talked about how the coronavirus has affected people's lives, but we haven't talked about. So we're talking about the economic impacts. Have we talked about the mental health impacts of people being stuck at their homes for weeks and weeks, and in some cases by themselves?
It's huge, but I guess I would argue in response, it seems to me that this is an apprehended health crisis so far, for all the reasons you've said, right? But assume that infection rates rise and correspondingly mortality rates rise. Once everyone knows someone who's died, and once it isn't just an 80-year-old person who had lung disease, and once people that we love are in hospitals but unable to access ventilators, and therefore we're actually rationing who dies and who lives, like if we get to that place in 4 or 6 weeks, then there's a whole other layer to this thing, and behavior will change again. People can mitigate and alter their behavior and adapt in radical ways in radical situations. I don't like the war analogies generally, but when you think about Britain being bombed, people did things that were inconceivable only a few weeks prior. And if people start dying, if we layer in that thing where people start dying in significant numbers, and there are people that we all know, then you're going to get, people won't be staying in their house because the government has told them to. They'll be staying in their house because they'll be scared if they don't, their fucking kid is going to die. And that's a layer of mental health stress and a layer of stress on the economy that we haven't factored in yet.
Okay, so we're saying that
you can't have a strong economy till you solve the virus problem, right, Jenny?
Okay, absolutely. But if we're saying that the virus is going to peak in a month or so, how is staying in our homes preventing that? It's not.
Yes, it is.
Like
it's preventing the transmission of it. It won't peak in a month. It will peak 6 months from now.
Well, its peak will be, the theory is it will peak, but its peak will be lower.
Okay, but eventually it's then going to peak. Like eventually everyone is going to get it. So like, I guess like what people have to come to grips with is how long they're willing to live like this. Do we peak? Like we're talking about peak transmission being the end of April. Like that's what hospitals are worried about. So we're doing all of these measures where we're not seeing each other. We're doing like video chats like this.
It can peak here or it can peak here. And if it peaks here, then the healthcare system collapses. And then, again, the mortality rates will rise enormously. And it won't be a question of whether or not our economy has ground to a halt. Our society will be a pane of glass that's just had a baseball thrown through it.
But eventually, are we going to end up peaking is what I'm asking. Whether it's in a month or whether it's in 3 months. That's the question I'm asking.
Well, first of all, you don't know because these things tend to have waves. So we'll find out in China and some of the other Asian countries whether they're taking their foot off too quickly. But the path we chose in this country is the path that is designed to have the lowest level of mortality rates from this disease. But it also means the disease is around longer than it would be under any other attempt to fight it, right? Because we're not just letting it run its course like a forest fire. We're trying to limit it so it's going to hang around longer. And that has implications for how long this all goes on with the economy. But it seems like we're at a really important principled point about whether or not that goal of limiting mortality from the disease is the overriding, to use the Star Trek terminology, the prime objective of the policy, or are we, as the president says, and as many other people say, we should be in a balancing act between managing mortality rates and keeping the economy going. I think we're right at this point of principle right now. We're going to make a decision. And I'm kind of scared. Listening to Trump yesterday, I was pretty scared about where that decision is going to go.
I'm also scared that Trump's decisions will force us into whatever happens in the States. I mean, obviously we closed the border, but transmission and travel between the two countries must remain fairly fluid, even in the strictest of circumstances. And so what they do pulls us along, and as in so many other ways. I mean, my belief is that we should be taking the strictest possible measures now to try to flatten that curve, shorten the time of transmission, lower the rates of mortality, and then give ourselves the best chance of resurrecting the economy to the greatest degree possible. And government must do everything in its power, including things that we didn't imagine it was empowered to do, to A, fight that health crisis and impose on people's freedoms for the next little while, and B, pay businesses to not lay people off so the economy doesn't come to a complete standstill and can be restarted. I really believe that. Otherwise,
where do we get the money?
You get the money.
Where do we get the money?
You got to reconceptualize.
Borrow it, print it.
You borrow it. You borrow it from other
who do we borrow it from?
You borrow it from other countries, and you borrow it from yourselves. You issue bonds, and here's what's going to happen.
I think she's edging toward an important point, Scott.
Where do you borrow
At the end of the day,
from?
It will be China.
At the end of the day, this virus will have been a tremendous thing for China.
So China, well, I mean, there is concern that maybe China could collapse because we don't know the level of debt it has already. But my working assumption is that the G20 will have to get together as central banks and as finance, and they'll have to say, we're going to have to invent new instruments, and we're going to have to look at the way that we do credit swaps between countries and debtor relationships between countries, because everyone is going to have to print shitloads of money and everyone is going to have to borrow. And yeah, I think China is going to have to do for the world what the United States did for Europe after the Second World War. There's going to be a global Marshall Plan, and whether we like it or not, probably China's going to underwrite a lot of it. So we need G20.
Well, that means they're the global leader
now. Well, that's why the G20, which has not been activated, needs to be activated so that this burden is built and spread across all the major developed nations and major developed economies. Otherwise, China will be doing it, picking one off after another, and I don't want to see that.
Well, so just so we're clear, then the United States goes from being the world superpower to China becoming the world superpower. That is a process what we're talking about.
Yes, that's right, Jenny, and that's a process that is disastrous for Canada, because nobody's ever had a better geographic situation in the history of the world than Canada. But it's a process that is in train right now and is going to happen over the next decade or two anyway.
I dispute that that's the only alternative.
And so this is definitely going to speed it up. And I'm not saying what about it. I mean, in the same way that Churchill and Roosevelt were meeting to discuss the post-World War II framework for the West, I think that Western nations need to be thinking about the post-virus world. Okay,
but that's okay. Fair, I agree with you, but then everyone that is criticizing Trump for thinking about the economy as we are in this healthcare, he's doing exactly what you're saying he should do. He's thinking about what yes, he is. He's thinking about the post coronavirus world.
Fuck, he's thinking about it.
He is. In fairness, he
that's exactly what David is doing.
Well, except that I don't think
I want it back to where it is, but where it was is not available right now. It's just not. So
I just don't understand how, in those circumstances, a president can look at a policy that could well result in 1 million deaths in the United States. I mean, given the infection rates, that's likely what would happen if you just let it run.
But if we just go back up one step, and if Jenny's argument is, look, this means that this will expedite the rise of China, perhaps it will. I don't think that's the alternative. Yeah. I think that, again, call the central bank governors of the G20 together and say, this is where this is headed, so that the burden isn't placed on exactly one country, which is another way of saying so that China doesn't put us all in its pocket. Let's spread this across all of our nations. Let's talk about who holds how much debt for each country. Let's decide on a comparable set of policies so that we spread that new rising debt burden across one another, and we develop new instruments to manage it so that it doesn't empower China to that degree. And so that we are all saying, yep, we're roughly doing the same thing. And we know that we're going to take policies that A, will not become hyperinflationary, and B, will spread this burden and risk across everyone. But that's what they did in 2009 in a more limited way, and they need to do it today. And I don't know why the G20 isn't being activated. I guess it's because the United States doesn't give a fuck about doing anything and isn't acting in a global.
I don't think that's fair.
And it's run by Saudi Arabia. It's run by Saudi Arabia, which nobody's that interested in their leadership. So
that's a big point.
You guys, can we just take a quick break for a word from a sponsor?
Yep.
And then we will come back and we will talk more about the Canadian government's response to this. If we have learned anything over the past few weeks, it's that in times of crisis, governments matter. So if you've never heard of Queen's Park Today, it's one of Ontario's most trusted news sources for political insiders and for people who actually need to know what is happening at the legislature every day. Whether it affects your business, your stakeholders, or the health and safety of your family, Queen's Park Today is tracking the ongoing developments in Ontario. The newsletter lands in your inbox first thing every morning so you can start your day off already ahead of the game. During a crisis, the importance of governments increases dramatically. The only way to really get the detailed boots-on-the-ground coverage you need is by subscribing to Queen's Park Today. There's also BC Today and Alberta Today, which are great for people who want to know what's going on out west, but don't have the time to follow it closely. To get a free 2-week trial of Queen's Park Today, BC Today, or Alberta Today, go to politicstoday.news and hit the free trial button. That's politicstoday.news/free trial. Okay, so how did Doug Ford get good at crisis management? He's a man who's getting a guy who many of his critics and skeptics might have expected him to put on a Trump-like shambolic performance. And indeed, at the very beginning, he might have seemed like he was heading in that direction with the go off and have a good time comments, but it hasn't been the case. He actually looks like he's governing. It looks like he's surrounded himself with the right group of experts, letting the right people make the decisions. And he is, he's leading and coordinating that whole thing and providing pretty good public leadership.
Agreed. But
this has been a turnaround, I think, for Doug Ford.
Well, it's common sense. He's balancing the economy right now versus the health concerns that Ontarians have.
I don't actually think that. I think if we're trying to reference a discussion and argument to a degree we just had, I don't actually see him on that front. I think he's been doing a good job because he's been demonstrably placing public health as the prime imperative. He literally got angry in the news conference the other day saying like, hey, people, go to fuck home. If you're coming back from Florida, do not stop at the grocery store. And so what I think he's been particularly good at.
Okay, but that's common sense. If you've traveled in the last month, self-isolating is what you have to do. You've decided to travel during a pandemic, so you can't have it both ways.
Well, I don't know. I'm not trying to have it both ways, but I mean, he just shut down. He just said this is who essential services are or not. So he's actually moving more stringently in a way that we know will impact the economy. So I don't actually see him as sort of, a la Trump. I don't think he's doing that. I think he's being driven by health imperatives first and foremost. And I think I just want to say because I'm not his biggest fan, obviously, but I want to give enormous credit. I think better than any politician in Canada, he's found a way to get the tone dead right. So if you notice, I find without the bravado or the false promises or the false hope of cures that we hear from Trump, Ford manages to lay out the facts on a daily basis. And then, I don't know, somehow there's a hint of sort of optimism or positive tone from him, which I think is, I guess it's a personality driven thing, but I think it's really impressive. So for anybody that ever
compared him to Trump, and sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead. You got one more thing to add.
Well, I was just going to say there's only one criticism I'd have, and it's not a criticism. It's a question mark. I'm puzzled by why they're doing a fiscal update because I don't know. What's the virtue of the fiscal update? Whatever their projections are, no matter how cautious or conservative or prudent, they're going to be thrown out the window within 3 weeks, given the enormity of this. So
don't you assume they're measures? I don't think it's a financial update. I think it's measures.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, well, then that would be interesting because that's not what I thought. I heard Rod Phillips saying the other day, look, we're being very prudent in our estimates. And so it was going to be a
But I don't think But I don't think we want politicians to completely throw out governing as well. Like we still have budgets to do. We still have like governing to do. Everyone seems to have it's all about tone and tenor. Let's talk about John Tory, for example. He went to London at the height of government saying don't travel internationally. He went to London for 4 days. He came back, did 2 days worth of meetings and media, like Metro Morning was all over the entire fucking city, and then said he had to self-isolate. Everyone is talking about tone and tenor. No one these politicians have to practice what
Typhoid Mary.
Yeah, but they okay. I don't know. I thought generally he's been self-isolating, but all I'm saying is.
But did he not come back? Did he not come back from London and spend 2 days doing media and meetings where he talked to how many people? He's lecturing.
Those were all virtual, weren't they? Are you certain?
No, he was.
I don't think he was.
Well, he did go to London at a time when it was dubious to go to London, as you left Canada at a time when it was dubious to leave Canada.
Go onto his Twitter. He went into Metro Morning Studio. He was in at CBC.
Okay, well, that's obviously.
Anyway, back to Ford. I was just going to express a general thing, which is to say that it's all a lot more professional than I might have expected it would be. The whole thing looks like a real functioning government. That's doing its job professionally. The second thing is, for anybody that ever compared him to Trump, and I may have been guilty of that from time to time, he's clearly got a humanity to him that distinguishes him from Trump quite fundamentally. He's clearly got real empathy for people, and he's clearly able to understand the human condition.
He always has. He's always had. You guys are the ones that have said he hasn't. He always has. That's Doug.
I don't know that I ever said that. But I think he demonstrates. Well, David called him a dick, but I've made the easy comparison because of the populist shtick and all that stuff to Trump, and I think David's right. I think that the great failing we see in Trump, is, apart from policy decisions we may disagree about, is that he can't get past his id. He's just a giant walking fucking id, and Doug Ford has not seemed obsessed with himself. He's been clearly and demonstrably motivated and focused on the public, as compared to Trump, who seems focused on himself. I mean, he's tweeting in the middle of the night about what the New York Times is saying about him, as opposed to being a president who says, how are people doing out there?
The Premier of Quebec, François Legault, has a 95% approval rating for his handling of this crisis. It's a pretty unusual number. I don't think that W hit that after 9/11 or anything like that. There's obviously an extraordinary consensus around the steps he's taking. Scott, do you have any idea why he's seen in Quebec is handling this so well?
Well, he has a decisive manner, and I think in a circumstance of crisis, people like decisive and definitive language. If you look at the hesitancy that a lot of leaders invoked in the first few days, for reasonable reasons, they were trying to figure out what to say and what to do. He betrayed none of that. He has a very authoritative, very definitive manner of speaking, and he was decisive from the outset. I think people cottoned on to that right away, and they liked it. Doesn't mean that he's always right, but I think that people in a crisis want someone who stands tall, squares their shoulders, and tells people what they should and shouldn't do, and in terms that are unequivocally easy to understand.
I agree with that.
Right. Was he super strong on that irregular border crossing thing? Is that part of what... the feds closed that.
Well, he was
irregular border crossing channel.
He was the strongest premier on the blockades, like the blockades in Quebec and Saint Laurent. He was the strongest in basically sending the police in to dispatch them.
That's interesting. From my perspective, I think the blockades might as well be 60 years ago as opposed to 6 weeks ago. I literally think that if you're evaluating the efficacy of a politician right now, it's got almost nothing to do with anything that preceded coronavirus.
No, but I'm just saying he had the political will to actually make those tough decisions 6 weeks ago.
I heard a rumor, I don't know if it's true. Maybe we'll see reports in a few days. But I heard a rumor that at the First Minister's meeting, I heard last night on the Monday evening, Quebec was pushing hard, Legault was pushing hard for the invocation of the Emergency Measures Act, which, if true, would be quite a thing that, Pierre Trudeau was getting his head kicked in by a Quebec premier who didn't want the War Measures Act imposed, and now the contemporary version of that, the Emergency Measures Act, you got the Quebec premier begging the Prime Minister, a new Trudeau, to do it. That's just kind of a neat little historical thing.
So that circles us back to the federal government, because I heard that call last night between the feds and the province went very badly, and that the provinces were pushing aggressively in unison for more proactivity from the government. I don't know what's happened to them, because I thought initially they had a very strong response to this, and the Prime Minister was totally correct, and they seem to be have organized themselves properly, and they did, I think, a lot of the initial things really right, including communications, but also policy. But I think in the last 2 weeks, they have fallen behind. They've become timid, both on fighting the virus and on economic stimulus. And I think they're falling behind, certainly falling behind the mood of the premiers, who have all declared states of emergency in their provinces. And falling behind the rest of the world in terms of economic action. So, I mean, I'm interested in why this government would be so cautious in this circumstance, as opposed to wanting to be a leader in this circumstance.
Well, I think these decisions are like, it's the same reason we're talking about the fact that Trump is weighing the economy versus people's health. This is a massive decision. Like, the decisions that our leaders make over the next few months can completely change our entire way of life. Like, I'm not saying this like a hyperbole. Like, our entire existence can change depending on what these leaders do. And Trudeau is a leader of a G7 country, and he is weighing this. I am not shocked by this. I was shocked last night by the bizarre legislation that they were planning on bringing in, and they've backtracked on. But I'm not shocked by the cautious nature that they've had. I think most governments would have the same.
Bill Morneau is never going to get a better chance to be a consequential finance minister.
Yeah, so I would have a slightly different take than you, David, but only a nuanced difference in take. And possibly I'm less charitable than Jenni, actually. I actually think that the Prime Minister and the team in general, because you're seeing waves of press conferences from ministers. Like, I think Patty Hadju's done an outstanding job, and I think the PM has gotten the tone right. He's good at that. So I think those things have been good. I think their response from a health perspective, by and large, has been good. It's at least harder for me to second guess those moves. I think they've made two mistakes, to be very direct. I think, one, the bill last night was a mistake. I'm glad they quickly pivoted and withdrew it. But more fundamentally, I am, as you say, Dave, I would separate the economic response from everything else. I think everything else gets a high grade. I think the economic response is wanting. I think they have to move rapidly. But as you know, I have a point of view about what that should be. So maybe my criticism is rooted in they're not doing what I think they should be doing. But I really feel that the inability to halt layoffs, like a 10% wage subsidy up to a maximum of $25,000 per small business or per business, is such an inadequate response that it's meaningless. And so I know.
Well, where's the plan? If it's not your plan, that's fine. So they don't like your plan, or they don't like UK's plan, or anybody else's plan. What is the plan? Right? Don't send the Prime Minister out to don't send the Prime Minister out to lecture me about shit. Tell me what the plan is. Right? If it isn't that you're going to support the economy, if it isn't that you're going to let the economy hum the way Trump is linking, then what is the plan? Right? What am I supposed to do with my business? I have no idea.
Well, 5 days ago, Morneau said, this is a foundation, there will be more measures. And since then, there have been no additional measures, and Parliament is meeting today to pass those measures. Now, they're giving themselves some license to do more through regulation. That's good. But I would expect it between last Thursday and now, there would have been more measures. If you have an incremental plan as they have, which I think is inadequate, then you would have thought there were going to be more incremental announcements. There haven't been. So they need to do more now because people aren't registering the layoffs in the same way that they're ticking the coronavirus infections. Like tens and 15,000s. I have a client who laid off 15,000 people the other day. Right. So massive layoffs are happening and they need to be halted, in my view, or they need
close to 1 million people applied for EI in Canada in the last week.
It's going to bust the fucking system. And so to me,
exactly.
I just think that strategy. Well, but then, Jenny, if you agree with that, then you have to have an alternative economic remedy. And to me, if you don't want people on EI, then you keep them at work. And if you keep them at work, there's only one way to do it. You pay people to keep them.
Listen, 40 years of neoliberal austerity has left us with a social safety net that is totally incapable of handling this. The automatic stabilizers in the economy were gutted years ago. So there's nothing remotely adequate that automatically kicks in. EI is a joke. It covers a third of the population and it doesn't help anybody. It is inadequate to really help anybody. You can't live on EI in most parts of the country. You can't even pay the rent on it in Toronto. So I mean, they do not have. We are in a situation. The entire Western world has done this to its social safety nets, and so that's why you're, Scott, scrambling to come up with a social safety net to support the economy through this period of time.
Well, you can take a check from your employer that's reduced, or you can take a check from the government that's mightily reduced, maybe supplemented with kind of income support that's going to be created out of thin air. But then you also have to trust that those systems for delivery from government are going to be sturdy enough and fast enough. I'm very anxious about it all. I think they should be just cutting out the middleman. Don't force people onto EI. Don't force them into that economic haircut. Don't force them into that psychological breach. And say, for the next 60 days, we're going to see if we can keep it afloat. And if after that we realize we can't, then I guess we move to what comes next. But they got to do that fucking now because those layoffs are happening. And once they're done, you can't undo them. You can't undo them rapidly anyway.
Jenny, I don't feel like you've had an adequate chance here in this discussion to state your opinion, as somebody that handled the pandemic crisis, to state your opinion about what the government literally ought to be doing. What do you think, like in all these options and all these things, you're clearly extremely skeptical of the big government response. So what would another response be?
No, I'm not actually skeptical. I actually think, I'm not sure that I would have, or like a conservative government, we would have done anything different in terms of the response that the government is doing up until this point. I think, though, that what governments in G7 nations, in G20 nations, have to be looking at is what we do in the next few months. And I think basically isolating people in their homes and shutting down the economies of major nations is just not workable. And so I think there has to be how we move forward. I'm not even sure what that is. I just don't think that we can sustain, but both from an economic level, but also from a mental health issue where people are going to accept this. I think it's going to get to a point where people in Canada are going to be like, I'm not doing this anymore. Like if you have respiratory illness or if you're like a senior citizen, you stay home, but I'm not anymore. And I think it's going to eventually get to that sooner rather than later.
So would you accept as a Canadian citizen, Jenny? Sure, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
As a Canadian citizen, would you accept the state monitoring your whereabouts if you were carrying COVID?
Yeah, I have no problem with the state monitoring what I do. I live a very boring life. So if people want to monitor what I do, I'm a conservative that has no problem with that. I have no problems with cameras in streets. I have no problems with that.
I do have
because that is, I mean, if you get enough test kits, you can literally test everybody. And then you can say, you people are fine, right? Go about your business. And you people have to stay home. And if you don't stay home, we're going to put you in jail. Like, you have to stay home.
Okay, so what's wrong with that? Like, Scott, why are you against that?
I'm against it in abstract. I'm not against it in practice in this circumstance. So my view is this: I'm uncomfortable with that. I'm uncomfortable with that imposition on civil liberties, but I recognize that this is an extraordinary thing. I'm calling for extraordinary economic measures. So I think by dint of logic, I have to be willing to accept extraordinary monitoring and other measures and incursions on civil liberties. To me, I think the pressure you're talking about, Jenny, one of the ways that you remedy that, test and trace heavily, right? Then you end up in a situation where you do monitor and say, all right, then you're allowed to go. And I'd be willing to surrender that for the purposes of safety and health for a period of time. But I want to know that the government is going to legislate that. It's going to have not just a review mechanism, but it's going to have this is time limited and collapses unless renewed factor. Like I want to see those protections in place. But I think it's really important, though, I come back to it, like we haven't experienced a psychological trauma of people we all know dying yet. And if the scientists are right, we will get there in a month and a half. And at that point, I'm not sure I'm going to need the government to tell me to stay inside my house. I've got 4 children. You won't be able to drag me out of my fucking house.
Okay, but this is what I mean. We're going to get there in a month and a half after having like shut down the economy and all of us like not leaving our homes. Like this is where I think people are going to get like, okay, this is happening regardless of what we do.
But if government
the inability to give people a time certain is a big flaw in this management strategy because people need some sort of date certain, and the sort of ambiguity about that I think is very difficult for people to manage. But there's this system that we're doing about flattening the curve does not give you a time frame. You cannot predict the time frame using this mechanism.
But government can invent one. So what I would do is I would say, okay, on the economic measures, you know what prescription I have. So let's assume that. So government says we're going to do that for 90 days. At the same time, for those 90 days, we're going to have either strict self-isolation or some process that this is the new norm for 90 days. At that point, then we review the economic measures. And at that point, we will shift, if we have met this, we'll then shift to monitoring and movement around. That's the game plan. Give people a sense of that and say, so we've got a 90-day battle, folks. And then when we get to day 87, we figure out whether or not we can implement it. And if it has to be extended to 120 days, then it's 60 more days and we deal with it then, or 30 more days. But I think you can actually create an artificial deadline that gives people some sense of expectation and rhythm, and then it's reviewed and updated if circumstances force it. But the ongoing ambiguity is going to make the anxiety that Jenny's talking about all the more unmanageable.
But why do you think people aren't saying the timeline? So if it's 90 days, so 3 months has basically been what?
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. 3 months is a long time. Like the reason that they basically said 2 weeks ending at March 31st is that's foreseeable. That's like 60 days away.
I'll tell you why. It's because 10 days ago, 2 weeks seemed like a long time. Now 3 months seems like a reasonable time. Our perceptions and our boundaries are shifting.
Is there going to be an NHL season next year?
Probably not.
An NHL season next year?
Probably not.
Probably not.
Maybe.
And again, to your point, David, the Leafs will complain that the cup was taken away from them.
It's not a shitty.
I think it's so interesting. Go ahead.
No, but I actually think 3 months to the average. Right. We are on the news and talking about this, and we're still doing media. So I think 3 months to us has become now more of a workable stat. I actually think to the average person who has an hourly wage, who has not fathomed how the next, past March 31st is going to be really fucking tough.
Well, for sure. By the way, it's no picnic for me. I'm in a house with, 3 kids at this point, and I'm self-isolated in the basement from them. So,
how many do you have?
I got 4 in total. One of them is on his own, so he's just out there, fighting the virus with a broadsword. But I hear what you're saying, Jenny. But I mean, when the choices become shitty and fatal, people pick shitty. And this thing is sliding on a constant basis.
But I think people pick that if they can pay their bills and they have a standard of living. So if people can't order takeout, and they can't buy groceries, and they can't go for a walk and maybe pick up things. And there is only so much that I think there is only so much money governments have. And so
I don't believe that. I literally don't believe that. Not in this circumstance. That can't be the answer. The answer has to be, and you say, for 90 days, we're going to do this. And if it's not done by then we'll have to figure out the next step. But for 90 days, folks, you're going to be in this more severe self-isolation. We're going to pay you to stay at home. Businesses are not going to be permitted to close. Businesses are going to be forced to take this money.
But how will the federal government even give money? They can't even pay their own employees through the Phoenix pay system, let alone actually get it to Canadians. If we even get to that point.
About the EI system, because if I can't get a lot of money, I'm going to be fucking worried about not getting a little money. Government, that's why you rely on the systems that are available in the private sector. Don't let those people get laid off and then have to get their check from the government. Use the infrastructure of business to get paid.
Jenni, you have an ideological issue with this, not a practical issue. Scott Clark and Pete DeVries, who Pete DeVries knows the books of Canada better than anybody. They said they're anticipating a $150 billion deficit, and they're not fussed about it.
My issue is I've only spoke practical right now. I've not spoken in terms of I've talked about the debt we've had. I am talking about practically how the government can deliver this, how the government can afford this, and how this is going to affect people's mental health, their psyche. That's pretty practical.
On your central point, though, about affordability, it is affordable, and it must be affordable because the alternative is worse. And by the way, it's entirely conceivable that the alternative will cost us more. Very conceivable.
So it's early to do this, but let's have a little bit of fun because we touched on this just a few minutes ago about is the government intervention in the economy going to get unwound at the end of this? Is government surveillance of citizens going to get unwound at the end of this? What do you each think this is going to, as Jenni said, change everything about our lives. And I can see it impacting everything from the kind of social interactions we have. Do people hug each other on the street anymore after this? To workplaces, do companies realize they don't need all this space and they don't need to have all these people coming into work every day? To really big things like globalization and how the world functions together. What do you think are the big lasting ramifications from this? Either one of you.
Well, I'm afraid the ramifications are going to be how we do things differently. I'm a very social person. I like to go out with friends. I go out for dinner. I go out for lunch. I like to be around people. I really hope that this doesn't change how we actually act with people, because I like being around people. I'd rather be sitting in a studio with you guys than doing this online. So I'm personally afraid that this is going to change our interaction with people, even past maybe when the virus has hopefully we've seen the influx, and I'm hoping it doesn't fully change how we interact with people. But I'm afraid that it happens.
I think especially if it hangs around at all. Yeah.
I don't think that will happen. I mean, we may have to wait till a point that's more distant than we can imagine right now, or would like to imagine, before things.
Well, you're such a touchy-feely guy to begin with.
Well, I'm not really, but I'll be honest with you. After 5 days of not being able to hug my kids, you say to yourself, I'll return to that behavior the second I am permitted to. So, I think you look at the Spanish flu, people didn't stop hugging each other or kissing one another or doing even more dastardly things once that threat passed. I think the human interaction will return to normal as soon as it possibly can, because that's an instinct, and I think it's imprinted into our DNA. I do think the greater risk is that there will be measures.
We're talking about platonic hugs and kisses here, Scott. Not your instincts.
I don't recognize platonic touching. I'm come big or go home, I say. So, if you're getting a hug from me, like, be ready. We're going we're going right to the house. But I don't think that will change. I think that will resume very easily, very naturally. I do worry about government measures. Like I worry about intrusions into civil liberties, and we say, okay, well, maybe there's some virtue and value in some of them. We'll try to preserve them in certain aspects of life because it will serve some convenient purposes. And I think we got to be very vigilant about that. I think that when we do extraordinary things, whether it's fiscal, economic, or more broad in terms of civil liberties, they should be sunsetted, and the onus should be on governments to renew and extend them. It shouldn't be leave them in place unless otherwise designated.
All right, so we have a little feature we'd like to do here at the Herle Burly in this time of COVID. There are many organizations out there that are doing such a good job in their communities to keep Canadians healthy and safe and as comfortable as possible in really difficult circumstances. And we'd like to help in our own small way by highlighting a few here on the pod, which will hopefully prompt some donations. So we've set up a page on our website, thehurlyburly.com/give. And if you go there, you'll find links to charities doing important work. Mine is the Shepherds of Good Hope in Ottawa. I used to live in the market area and take my dog Shadow for walks in Majors Hill Park. So I walked through the market every morning and every evening, and I got to know the homeless people living there. I got to see the trajectory of life on the street. And it was very, very moving. And I really have been very committed to the work that the Shepherds of Good Hope do in that neighborhood in terms of shelter and food bank services ever since. So in this time of difficulty with food banks, people are having trouble getting volunteers, they're having trouble getting food. I'd like to support that group. Jenny?
I would like to say the Scott Mission in downtown Toronto. It's a charity that a very good friend of mine has been involved with and has done a lot of work with in the last several years. Also, the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Network at Sunnybrook Hospital.
Great. I support that Scott Mission too for the same reasons that David articulated. A lot of people like to say, well, I want to give to kids. A lot of people say, I want to give to this group. And a lot of people forget those that are on the margins, like folks at the two missions. So I think that's great. Mine is a little bit different. I'm supporting the Unison Benevolent Fund, and it's been set up just in recent days to help Canadian artists and musicians, because those folks don't live paycheck to paycheck. They live like 1/4 paycheck to a paycheck, and there's no place to play. There's no place to perform other than online right now. And I think they're easily overlooked as a group of people that are going to find it very, very hard to make ends meet in this time. So, and all of us love music. So, unisonfund.ca, go and give some cash to those folks.
Nice. Thank you both for joining us. Good to see you're both healthy. We'll, I guess, keep doing this. And, maybe we should look at this as a weekly thing. Maybe we should look at this as a weekly thing through the crisis. Anyway, we'll ponder that and get back to our folks. Thank you, everybody, for listening today. I would like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, Queen's Park Today. I would really like to particularly give thanks to Jill Engelman, who put a tremendous amount of work into making sure that this podcast could be pulled off in this format and making everything work as seamlessly as it has. So thank you, Jill. You're a constant source of strength to this podcast. And Jenny, with no NHL season this year, we can pretend that it's 1986 and the Montreal Canadiens are winning the Stanley Cup behind Patrick Roy's Conn Smythe and Rookie of the Year goaltending, and my guy, Mats Naslund, flying down the left wing to take a pass from Bobby Smith and go in and score. So there we go. Patrick Roy, Mats Naslund, Little Viking, wherever you are, God bless you. Thank you for listening, everybody. Until next week, it's the Herle Burly. I think that was good.
Was that okay?
I think it was good.